Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we'll see how we can perform CRUD operation using Spring Boot REST API and MySQL database. So here I am on the Spring initializer and I am going to create the basic project structure first. So here you can see I have selected the language as a Java and the project type as Maven. Next here I have selected the Spring Boot version 3.5.0 and the packaging as jar with the Java version 21. Now we'll be focusing on adding the dependency. Now as I am using the MySQL database, first I will be adding the MySQL dependency. Next, I will be adding the web dependency. This will provide the embedded Tomcat server, meaning you don't need a separate server to deploy this application. Also, it will provide support for the REST controllers. Next, we'll be adding the JPA dependency. This will provide support for adding the repository layer in our application. After adding this dependency, we will be clicking on generate. This will download the project in a zip file format. You need to import this in IntelliJ or any other IDE. And to save time, I have already imported the project in IntelliJ. So let me show you that. So this is a project I have already imported, and inside the application.properties I have added database related configuration. Here you can see I have configured URL, username and password for the database. You need to update this according to your database. Here 3306 is a database server port and Spring Java Lab is a schema that I have created in MySQL server. Let me show you that. So here is the Spring Java Lab schema and it contains one table employee on which we are going to perform CRUD operation. Now employee table contains 3 columns, ID, name and email. And here I've set ID to be auto increment. So each time you insert an employee, ID will be generated automatically by MySQL server. Now I have prepared one Google document which contains the architecture that we are going to follow. Let me show you that. So this is a Google document I just mentioned and I will attach the link of this in the pinned comment so you can refer this later as well. So this is a standard architecture that is being followed in most of the REST applications that involves database connection. So here the request will be coming from the web or the Postman that will act as a client. In this example, we will be using Postman as our client. Now the request will be received by the REST controllers and it will be calling the appropriate service layer method. Inside the service layer, we can add the validations, business logic and the call to repository layer. Inside the repository layer, we will be adding the call to the database. In our case, we will be adding the code to perform CRUD operations. Now if we see CRUD operation overview, we will be designing different REST endpoints. We will be designing the post endpoint for the create operation. We will be designing get endpoint for the read operation. We will be designing the put endpoint for the update operation. We will be designing delete endpoint for the delete operation. Now before starting the development, one request. I am a beginner on YouTube, so if you can like this video and subscribe to my channel, it will be a token of appreciation and motivation for me. Now let's go to IntelliJ and start our development. Now first we will be starting with adding the entity. We will be adding the employee entity. For that I am creating one class employee and this will be entity class so that it will be mapped to the employee table in the database. Now employee table contains 3 columns, so we will be adding those as a field here. So private long ID. The other two was name. So private string name, private string email. Now ID, as I mentioned, it's the primary key of the employee table, so we can indicate that using @ID. Next, ID is auto increment, so for that we need to use @generated value. Here we'll be providing the strategy as generation type dot identity. Next we'll be generating the getters and setters for this employee class. Now our employee entity is ready, which is mapped to the employee table in the database. Now we'll be working on the repository layer. For that we'll be using the JPA. So let me just create one interface. It will be a simple interface, employee repo, and it will be extending the JPA repository. So extend JPA repository. Here we will be providing the type as employee and the primary key of employee is of type long. So we'll be providing long, and this is a repository layer, so we can indicate to using @repository. Now it will provide different methods and its implementation will be automatically provided by Spring Boot at runtime. Now next step is to work on the service layer. So let me create one service class. It will be employee service. Now as this is a service class, we'll be using @service annotation. Now as I mentioned, the service layer will be calling the repository layer. So we need the repository layer here. So we can get that using @auto-add private employee repo. Now here we'll be adding different method for our CRUD operations. So let's first start with add or update. So let me just create one method, public. We'll be returning the employee after saving it. So I'm keeping the return type as employee. I'm just importing it. Now let me name it as save or update employee. Here we'll be getting employee as a parameter from the controller. Now we'll be simply calling return employee repo dot save employee. Now as I mentioned, the implementation for this methods will be provided by Spring Boot at runtime, so we don't need to worry about the implementation. Now let's say you want to retrieve a particular employee. So in that case, I'm again creating one method that have the return type as employee. Let me name it as get employee by ID. And here the method parameter will be ID that will be getting from the controller. So we'll be simply again calling the repository layer employee repo dot find by ID. Now let's say there is no employee with a particular ID. In that case, we can return null. Now let's say you want to retrieve all the employees from the table. In that case, we'll be creating one method that will return a list of employees. Let me name it as get all employees, and we'll be again simply calling the method from the JPA repository. So employee repo dot find all. So again, the implementation will be provided by Spring Boot at runtime. Next, we'll be adding a method to delete an employee. Let me create one method, public void delete employee. Here we'll be getting the ID of the employee which we need to delete. And we'll be again simply calling employee repo dot delete by ID. So here you can see we have created the service layer for all the CRUD operations. Now we'll be focusing on creating the controllers. Inside the controllers, we'll be creating different endpoints that we discuss. So let me create the controller first. Let me name it as employee controller. And as this is a REST controller, we'll be using the annotation at REST controller. Next, we need to tell Spring what all requests will be handled by this particular controller. So let me do that using at request mapping. So here I'm specifying the part that all the requests that are coming to the endpoint slash API slash employee will be handled by the employee controller. Now, as I mentioned, the controller will be calling the service layer. So we need to get the service layer here. So we can get it using at @AutoWire. Here we'll be injecting the bean for the service. So let me do that using private employee service. Now we'll be focusing on creating the REST endpoint for different CRUD operation. First, let me add the post endpoint for the create operation. For that, we'll be using post mapping public employee. Let me name it as save employee. Now the data from the client will be coming in the JSON format, and to map that data to the employee object, we can use request body. So let me use request body employee. By using this, Spring Boot will automatically map the incoming JSON to employee object. Now it will be very simple. We'll be just calling the service layer. So return employee service dot save or update employee. Now let's say you want to retrieve all the employees from the table. For that, we'll be creating the get endpoint. So we can do that using @get mapping. We'll be returning a list of employees. So list of employee get all employees. And again, we'll be just invoking the service layer. So return employee service dot get all employees. Now let's say you want to retrieve employee with a particular employee ID. So in that case, again, we'll be designing the get endpoint. Now the user will be passing the ID in the URL. So we can specify using ID. Now we'll be just creating one method that will be returning the employee. Let me name the method as get employee by ID. Now the ID is in the URL. We need to retrieve this ID. So we can do that using @path variable. Here we'll be declaring the one variable ID. So whatever the ID user will be passing the URL will be mapped to this ID in the path variable. So we'll be again calling the service layer return employee service dot get employee by ID. Now let's say you want to delete a particular employee. So for that we'll be using the delete mapping. So @delete mapping. Again, we need the ID of the employee which needs to be deleted. So we can specify it in the same manner, and we'll be again using the path variable. So let me just create one method, public void delete employee, and here we'll be using path variable long ID. Now it will be again very simple. We'll be just calling employee service dot delete employee. Here we'll be passing the ID of the employee that needs to be deleted. Now let's say you want to update a particular employee. So we'll be using the put endpoint. So let me just create a put mapping. Again, we need the ID of the employee which needs to be updated. So we can do that in the same manner. Here I'll be defining the ID, and we'll be retrieving this ID using the path variable. So public employee update employee. Here, as I mentioned, we'll be using path variable. So path variable long ID. Next, we need the data as well. So data again will be sent in a JSON format, and we can map that data in the employee object using request body. So I'll be just using request body employee. Now whatever ID user will pass in the ID, will be setting that to the employee object. So we'll be just using employee dot set ID, and Now we'll be simply calling the service layer. So return employee service dot save or update employee. So with this, we have completed the coding for the CRUD operation. We have added the REST endpoints in the controller. We have added the code in the service layer. We have also designed the repository layer. Now it's time to test our application. So let me start the server. Once the server is started, we'll be sending request to /API/employee using Postman. So let me open the Postman. Meanwhile, the server is getting started. Now server started successfully. Let me create some employees using the post endpoint. We will be sending request to localhost 8080 slash API slash employee, and we'll be passing the data in a JSON format as we discussed. So we'll be selecting row. Here we're selecting the type as JSON. Let me pass the data in a JSON format. So we need to pass name. Let's say the name of the employee is Rohan, and email as well. So email will be rohan@gmail.com. We'll be clicking on send. So here you can see employee with ID 1 and name Rohan has been created. Now let's say we want to create one more employee with a name Rahul. So we'll be just updating the name and email here. And again, we'll be clicking on send. So here you can see the employee with the ID 2 and name Rahul has been created. Now let's say you want to retrieve all the employees. So in that case, we'll be using the get endpoint. We don't need to pass any ID here. We don't need to pass even the payload. We'll be just clicking on send. So here you can see it has written the two employee with ID 1 and 2 that we have created. Now let's say you want to update any employee. For that we'll be using the put endpoint. And let's say you want to update the employee with ID 1. So we'll need to pass the ID 1 here, and again we need to pass the payload. Now let's say we want to update the email of the employee from rahul@gmail.com to rahul@yahoo.com. So we'll be just clicking on send. So here you can see it has updated the employee email. Now let's say you want to retrieve a single employee from the database. In that case, we'll be using the get endpoint and we'll be passing the ID in the URL. Let's say we want to retrieve the employee with the ID 2. So we'll be just changing the ID to 2. We don't need any payload here, and we'll be clicking on send. So here you can see the get endpoint is also working where we have retrieved the employee with ID 2. Now let's say you want to delete the employee with a particular ID. In that case, we'll be changing the request type to delete. And we'll be just clicking on send. So it will delete the employee with ID 2. So now we can test whether the employee with ID 2 is deleted or not. For that we'll be using the get endpoints, and we'll try to retrieve all the employees. We'll be just clicking on send, and now here you can see it has written only employee with ID 1 and name Rahul. So with this we complete our CRUD operation using Spring Boot REST API and MySQL database. Next we'll be working in upcoming videos on the validation part. So if you found this content informative, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like this video. See you in the next video. Thank you. Bye bye.